While hiking through the dense forest near her home, Laura stumbled upon an old, rusted vehicle half hidden by overgrown bushes. She held her breath as she approached it, wondering how it had ended up in such a remote spot, far from any roads or trails. The surrounding trees loomed tall, their branches knitting together to block most of the sunlight, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Her curiosity wrestled with her growing unease. Something about the car felt wrong. The windows were caked with grime and moss, making it impossible to see inside. The metal was streaked with rust, and vines twisted through the broken grille and around the tires. Laura's fingers trembled as she reached for the creaky door handle. The resistance of the door gave way with a screech, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent forest. Inside, the sight that greeted her made her stomach churn. A human skeleton, half covered in decayed clothing, slumped in the driver's seat. Its bony fingers rested unnaturally on the steering wheel, as if frozen mid-drive. The empty socket seemed to stare at her, hollow and accusing. For a moment Laura couldn't breathe. Her body felt paralyzed, locked in place as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Then, the scream came raw and primal, tearing through her throat and shattering the oppressive silence of the forest. She stumbled back from the car, her foot catching on the root of a tree. She fell hard, the impact jarring her senses. Pain shot through her palms as she scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her ears. Laura's instinct screamed at her to run, and she obeyed, bolting into the forest without a second glance. The trees blurred past her as she pushed herself to move faster, desperate to put distance between her and that horrific discovery. Her lungs burned and her legs ached, but she didn't stop until she was sure she had run far enough. Finally, she collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. Sweat dripped down her face as she tried to calm herself, her mind racing with questions. Who was that? How had they ended up in the middle of nowhere, trapped in a rusting tomb? And why did this feel so much worse than just an abandoned car? Reaching for her phone, Laura's heart sank when she realized it wasn't in her pocket. Frantically, she patted herself down, checking every pocket in vain. It must have fallen out when she tripped by the car. The thought of going back filled her with dread, but she knew she had no choice. Without her phone, she couldn't call for help, couldn't report what she'd found. Swallowing hard, she turned and began retracing her steps, each step heavy with reluctance. The forest felt different now. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set her on edge. The once soothing sounds of nature had become menacing, each noise a potential threat. When she finally reached the clearing where the car sat, she paused at the edge, her body frozen with fear. The vehicle loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the tangled underbrush. She steeled herself and approached cautiously, her gaze fixed on the open door. What she saw made her blood run cold. The skeleton was gone. Laura's knees nearly gave out as she stared into the empty car. The decayed clothes remained, draped eerily over the seat, but the bones were missing. Her mind raced. Had someone moved it? Was someone else out here? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She spun around, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. But the trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. No, Laura whispered, backing away from the car. The situation had escalated from horrifying to surreal. She wasn't alone in the woods. Someone else had to be here, someone who had taken the skeleton. Her breaths came shallow and fast as she fought to keep herself from panicking. She needed proof, something to show the authorities, to validate what she'd seen. Reaching into her backpack, she pulled out her camera, a small but reliable device she often carried on her hikes. She began snapping photos of the car, capturing every angle, every detail. She photographed the vines, the interior, the decayed clothing. Her hands shook as she adjusted the focus, her paranoia growing with each passing second. As she leaned closer to the car for a better shot, something on the floor caught her eye. A piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, lay partially tucked under the seat. Hesitating, Laura debated whether to touch it. Finally, her curiosity won out and she carefully reached inside, her fingers brushing against the fragile material. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes widening as she took in the markings. It was a map, crude and hand-drawn. It depicted a portion of the forest with various trails and landmarks. One spot, marked with a bold X, stood out. The annotations were cryptic, a mix of symbols and shorthand that she couldn't immediately decipher. Her heart pounded as she studied the map, questions swirling in her mind. Was this connected to the skeleton? Did it hold clues about what had happened here? She folded the map and tucked it into her pocket, deciding she'd figure it out later. Right now she needed to get to safety. Her priority was finding a spot with a phone signal so she could call for help. As she walked, the forest seemed to close in around her, the towering trees and dense foliage creating a labyrinth of shadows. She checked her phone repeatedly, praying for even a single bar of signal. The oppressive quiet of the woods made every sound seem amplified: the crunch of her boots on the leaves, the soft rustle of branches in the wind. And then she heard something else. A faint noise, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to make her freeze. It was a rustling, deliberate and slow, coming from behind her. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She turned her head slightly, straining to listen. The noise stopped. Her eyes darted around, scanning the trees, but she saw nothing out of the ordinary. "It's probably just an animal," she whispered to herself, though her voice wavered with doubt. She quickened her pace, her nerves frayed. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, like a weight pressing down on her. When a bar finally flickered onto her phone screen, she nearly cried with relief. She dialed 911 with trembling hands, her voice shaky as she spoke to the dispatcher. "There's an old car in the woods," she began, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "There was a skeleton inside, but now it's gone. I don't know what's happening. Please, you have to send someone." The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to her panic. They asked for her location and as many details as she could provide. Laura did her best to explain, describing the car and its eerie surroundings. When she mentioned the map, the dispatcher's tone shifted slightly. "Can you bring that map to the station?" they asked. "It might help us figure out what's going on." Laura hesitated. The thought of trekking back through the forest, especially with the growing darkness, was daunting. But she knew she couldn't leave the map behind. "All right," she said finally. "I'll head there now." She tucked her phone away and started walking again, this time with a renewed sense of urgency. Every step felt heavier, the shadows around her deepening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The oppressive silence of the forest was broken only by the crunch of her boots and the occasional distant rustle. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, though every time she turned around, the forest appeared empty. Nightfall brought a new kind of fear. The once familiar woods transformed into a maze of darkness, where every shadow seemed alive with malice. Laura gripped her flashlight tightly, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom but offering little comfort. She kept moving, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. When she finally emerged from the trees and saw the distant lights of the police station, a wave of relief washed over her. She quickened her pace, practically running the last stretch. The fluorescent lights inside the station felt harsh after the dim, oppressive forest. Laura approached the front desk, her heart still racing as she recounted her story to the officer on duty. "Please, you have to believe me," she pleaded, placing the map on the counter. "There's something out there. I don't know what's there, but I know I'm not alone." The officer glanced at the map, his expression shifting from skepticism to intrigue. "This is unusual," he muttered, tracing the crude markings with his finger. His brow furrowed when his eyes landed on the bold X. "Do you have any idea what this point might signify?" Laura shook her head, exhaustion and fear clouding her thoughts. "No, I found it in the car," along with her voice trailed off as she hesitated to say it out loud again. "The skeleton." The officer gave her a sympathetic look. "You've been through a lot. Let's get someone to check out the area and the vehicle. Can you show us on this map where the car was located?" She nodded, her finger hovering over the approximate spot. Another officer stepped forward, a man in his late 30s with a no-nonsense demeanor. "I'll take a team out there," he said, already gathering his equipment. "In the meantime, you should stay here, miss. We'll keep you safe." Laura wanted to protest, to insist on going with them, but her body was screaming for rest. She sank into a chair in the waiting area as the officers mobilized. Her mind raced with questions. Who had moved the skeleton? What did the map lead to? And most haunting of all, was she truly safe now? Minutes turned into hours as she waited. The hum of the station's fluorescent lights was almost soothing compared to the oppressive silence of the forest. But her relief was short-lived. As she replayed the events in her mind, new details began to surface, small things she hadn't noticed before. The strange scratches on the car's exterior, the unnatural way the vines seemed to cradle the vehicle, and the faint metallic smell in the air that didn't belong to rust. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. The officer who had gone out with the team returned, his face pale. He approached her, his expression grim. "We found the car," he began, his voice low. "But there was no sign of the skeleton, or the map you described." Laura's stomach dropped. "What? That's impossible." "I left the map here," she pointed to the counter where she had placed it, but it was gone. Her heart pounded as she looked around the room, her eyes scanning for any sign of the paper. The officer exchanged a glance with his colleagues. "Are you sure you brought it in?" he asked gently. "Yes," Laura insisted, panic creeping into her voice. "I showed it to you. You saw it too." The officer frowned, clearly unsettled. "We believe you," he said carefully. "But something strange is going on here. The area around the car was unusual. The trees nearby looked as if they'd been scorched, and there were footprints leading away from the site." "Footprints," Laura whispered, her throat tightening. "Human or—" The officer hesitated. "They weren't human. At least, not entirely." A heavy silence filled the room. Laura's chest tightened as she tried to process his words. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right explanation. The prints were large, clawed, and there was a strange pattern to them. It's hard to explain, but whatever made them wasn't walking upright the entire time. It looked like it moved between crawling and standing. Laura's pulse raced. The memories of the forest, the feeling of being watched. The rustling in the trees took on a more sinister meaning. Do you think it's still out there?" The officer didn't answer right away. His silence was more telling than any words could have been. Finally, he said, "We're going to keep a close watch on the area. In the meantime, we'd like you to stay somewhere safe." Laura nodded numbly, her mind racing with questions and fears. That night, she couldn't sleep. Even within the supposedly safe walls of the police station, she felt exposed, vulnerable. Every creak of the building made her flinch, her imagination conjuring images of clawed shadows creeping toward her. The next morning, the officers showed her photographs of the car and its surroundings. One image caught her attention, a close-up of the seat where the skeleton had been. The decayed clothing was still there. But something else had appeared in its place, a series of deep scratches etched into the metal frame of the seat. They formed a crude but unmistakable shape, a symbol she didn't recognize. "That wasn't there before," Laura said, her voice shaking. "I would have noticed it." The lead officer, a woman named Detective Harris, leaned closer to examine the photograph. "This symbol," she murmured. "It looks familiar." Laura's eyes widened. "You've seen it before?" Harris nodded slowly. "There's an old case in the archives unsolved. A similar symbol was found carved into a tree near another missing person site." "What happened to them?" Laura asked, her stomach churning. "They were never found," Harris admitted, her tone grim. "But there were reports of strange sightings in the area, shadows moving without a source, unearthly sounds." Laura's hands clenched into fists. "What does this mean? Is this connected to the car?" "The skeleton." Harris hesitated before answering. "It's possible. Whatever's happening, it's unlike anything we've dealt with before. We'll keep investigating, but in the meantime, I suggest you stay away from the forest." Laura nodded, but deep down, she knew this was far from over. The forest had revealed its secrets to her, and she doubted it would let her go so easily. A.